Sorry.
Okay. So I'm Garry Keenor. I'm professional aid for education at Israelis. I know a lot of faces in this room, so I used to work with you. It's a bit like a school reunion, but I'm also, as Nick has alluded to, I'm deputy president of RailEI as well. I'm really glad to say I'm deputy president of RailEI, not PWI anymore, so really good to see. And yeah, I'm going to try and make what could be quite a dry topic interesting, so we'll see how I get on. You can tell me at the end how I've done. It's going to be a game of two halves, this. The first half of the session, I'm not going to talk about our standards development. I'm going to talk about the strange position that Northern Ireland finds itself in legally and in relation to the TSIs. And then I need to do that in order for everything that follows on the second half to make sense. So apologies, I will get there eventually. So we'll talk a bit about the relationship between Northern Ireland, Great Britain and the EU, what Northern Ireland Railways actually looks like, what its characteristics are, what its electrification plans are, and also what those in the Republic are as well, because they're inextricably linked. Quick reminder of what TSIs and NNRs are, and then we'll get into the actual process of what we've done, which is to adopt and adapt GB standards for Northern Ireland, how we do that, how the story went, how the work expanded, and I'll finish by explaining what some of the challenges are of writing standards, and then we'll do our usual Q&A at the end. Before I do that, though, and I will apologise for there might be some people from Ireland, north or south, dialing in. I'm sure you guys all know this, but a surprising number of people in Great Britain do not understand the structure of the United Kingdom, so I'm just going to briefly go through it for you. Completely aware. So on the left we have the United Kingdom, the UK. The UK is a country. To give it its full name is United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the clue is there. So the UK comprises 4 countries: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Before anyone goes on the chat, I am aware that Wales is a principality. I don't want to annoy my Welsh colleagues, so I treat it as a country. And Northern Ireland isn't strictly a separate country, but it looks and feels like a separate country. So just go with it, okay? So that's the UK. Then we've got Great Britain, which is the UK minus Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is not part of Great Britain. Then we've got the Republic of Ireland, which is the southern portion of Ireland, which is a separate country and is an EU, crucially for this discussion, is an EU member state. And then we have the island of Ireland. Confusingly, a lot of people call the Republic of Ireland, Ireland. If you do that, you're at risk of upsetting our friends in the north of Ireland. So I don't do that. I'll refer to it as the Republic. But if you put the Republic and Northern Ireland together, you get the island of Ireland. Okay? So, to recap, Northern Ireland isn't part of the UK. It is not part of Great Britain. The Republic of Ireland is not part of the UK or Great Britain, but it is a member of the EU. And that becomes very important to what comes next. Right, I'm going to read this back because it's so complicated, honestly. I mean, we've been working with this for 2 years and I still can't remember it. So, you'll probably be aware that the UK is no longer in Europe. We left. Brexit and all that stuff. So after we left the EU, a deal was done with the EU, and under that deal, Northern Ireland has special status. And it has special status for 2 reasons. One is that it shares a land border with an EU member state, and the other is that it has a history of civil conflict. Putting a hard border in between north and south would have probably reignited that conflict. We didn't think about that when we left the EU. But now we have to. So for the purposes of railway regulation, Northern Ireland is in the EU, kind of, sort of, not really. Partially, maybe. So how is that? How can that possibly be the case? So we signed the EU United Kingdom withdrawal agreement. And as part of that withdrawal agreement, under a thing called the Northern Ireland Protocol, right? There is a thing, and then that was later amended by the Windsor Agreement. Under those agreements, Northern Ireland continues to need to comply with the Interoperability Directive. And the Interoperability Directive is what mandates the use of the railway interoperability regulations. And the railway interoperability regulations mandate that you must comply with the TSIs. So the short version of that is Northern Ireland has to comply with the TSIs, not, as Great Britain does, the NCSNs. So it is unique in that respect within the UK. And that gives Northern Ireland some real problems, because the TSIs, if the naked TSIs wouldn't suit any of our railways, GB, Northern Ireland, because it's completely different, very different looking railway to those in Europe. So we have things called specific cases. In the TSIs, there are country-specific cases that give permission for those countries to deviate effectively from the TSI, from the main clauses. Because otherwise, you wouldn't be able to build and operate that railway. The UK used to have specific cases in the TSIs that suited the characteristics of our railways, with the small loading gauge and all the other things that are unique about UK rail. Of course, after we left the EU, the European Rail Agency, looking after TSIs, they pulled all the UK specific cases out of the TSIs because they're not needed anymore, are they? Except if you're in Northern Ireland. So we're in a situation now where Northern Ireland has no country-specific cases in the TSIs. It has nothing that allows it to be the kind of railway that it is, and we'll explain what we mean by that later on. And it's worse than that, because EU member states have a seat at the table. The TSIs are written by people, and they can be changed, believe it or not. And EU member states have well-established mechanisms for influencing and directing the direction of the TSIs. But Northern Ireland's not a member state, so Northern Ireland doesn't have a seat at the table. So it's required to comply. It's a rule taker, but it's not a rule maker. So that leaves Northern Ireland in a bit of an awkward position. And that's a problem which Northern Ireland, the Department for Infrastructure and the Department for Transport are now beginning to grapple with. So let's move away from the legality and move on to something we're all more comfortable with, which is what does a railway look like? So some of you might be familiar with Northern Ireland Railways, but for those of you who aren't, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the GB network, but in several crucial ways, it's completely different. The ways in which it's similar, it's the same. It was built by the same Victorian contractors that built railways in GB. By the way, if you want to know what GB, Great Britain, from now on, they'll be hearing me say GB a lot. Northern Ireland network, very similar to GB in terms of small vehicle gauge, tight bridges, very, very similar in that respect. Crucial differences, though, none of it's electrified. It is a fully diesel railway today, but that's going to change in future. Another key difference is that TransLink, which is the operator I will use TransLink and Northern Ireland Railways interchangeably, because TransLink's the brand name, Northern Ireland Railways is the company name. But TransLink is a vertically integrated operator. It owns all the stations, all the infrastructure, and it operates all the trains. It also operates all the buses in Northern Ireland. So it's a properly integrated transport provider. And crucially, one of the biggest differences, and it's really important when we came to write these standards, is the size of this network. It's tiny compared to the GB network. It is 2% of the size, 333 route kilometres versus 15,500 in GB. And another way of explaining that difference in scale, a couple of ways. So TransLink has 4,000 employees, and some of those employees are running the buses. So actually less than 4,000 employees running Northern Ireland's railways. If you put Network Rail and all the train operators together, they have about 100,000 employees. So again, less than 4% of the staff and the resources. And that becomes really important when you start thinking about developing standards for a small railway. Another way of looking at it is you can do the entire Northern Ireland railway network in one day. Ask me how I know. So because of the size, because of the nature of Northern Ireland Railways, their traditional approach to standards is they just use GB standards. They've just been adopting RSSB and Network Rail standards wholesale. They'll literally take a standard, they'll put a Northern Ireland Railways cover sheet on it, and they'll say, follow that. That's been historically the approach. And there's good reasons for that. There's a perception that the GB standards align with the TSIs and the BSENs, which is largely true, but not entirely true all the time. And the other thing is that the supply chain in Northern Ireland to do work on the railways is the same supply chain in GB. So if you're a designer, if you're a contractor, then obviously familiarity of standards is really helpful. So using the same standards makes it easy for work to get done. But that's the problem. Now that the Windsor Agreement's in place, that doesn't work anymore, because now Northern Ireland is exposed to the European bureaucracy in a way that it wasn't before. Before, it could kind of sit behind DFT, and DFT would manage the interrelation with ERA and everything else. But now Northern Ireland kind of has to stand on its own 2 feet and explain to the EU how it's complying with the TSIs. And there are obvious differences. There are obvious ways in which just using GB standards don't work. So for those of you not familiar, the track gauge in Northern Ireland is 1600 millimetres. It is not 1435 millimetres as it is in GB. And that's the same in the Republic. So there are differences between the railways, and therefore there needs to be differences in the standards. So just going to talk very briefly about Northern Ireland's electrification plan. So there's an excellent document that was published in 2024 called the All Ireland Strategic Rail Review. If you haven't had a read of it, I'd recommend you go and grab a copy. And it is an all Ireland of Ireland strategy. You cannot have a railway strategy for the Republic that doesn't deal with the North, or vice versa. So it has lots of good things in it, lots of big plans. But for Northern Ireland, crucially, the main thing relevant to this talk is that Northern Ireland intends to electrify all of its routes. So the main route from Belfast to Dublin will be electrified 25 kV AC, conventional electrification. And the rest of the routes in Northern Ireland will be electrified 25 kV AC, discontinuous with battery trains. That's the plan. There are big plans, as I say, big plans in the Republic. Republic are also looking at electrifying their core routes 25 kV AC. Right, a quick reminder for some of you, maybe younger people who go, what the hell is he talking about? What are TSIs? Technical specifications for interoperability. A set of EU regulations, they are law. They are not just standards, they are law. And they define requirements which you must meet. And the requirements are generally the interfaces between subsystems. So the energy TSI, for instance, defines the interfaces between the electrification system and rolling stock and track and all the other systems. There are also things called NNRs, which you might have known as NNTRs. They were Notified National Technical Rules. They've now been renamed as Notified National Rules because some of them are technical requirements. And they are basically, NNRs exist within national standards, so they sit below the TSIs in national standards, and they do one of 3 things. They either fill an open point in the TSI, or they support a country-specific case in a TSI, or they are there to deal with alignment with legacy systems, which were built before the TSIs existed. And you have to comply with the TSIs, and you need to have national rules which you then notify to the European Rail Agency. That's what the regulations tell us we want to do. So Northern Ireland now needs to notify its decide what its national rules are, and then notify them to the ERA. So that's kind of part 1. That's all preamble. Now we'll actually get into the meat of what we did. So in late 2023, Northern Ireland Railways were beginning to realise that they were in a brave new world, and they were probably feeling a bit exposed, and they're not unsure of themselves as to what they needed to do. They knew that they needed to electrify the network. They knew they didn't have any standards, but they also knew that they had to comply with the energy TSI, but they didn't necessarily understand what gotchas might sit within it. Obviously, with those specific cases being removed, now, the question they asked us is, if you have a look and tell us what, if there are any clauses in there that are going to cause problems for us when we electrify, either in terms of just not being practical or driving cost. And we've all of you who've been through the CP5 electrification schemes know that generally, if you've got those clauses, you know, a clause can do huge damage if it isn't practical to deliver it, because you end up spending a lot of money trying to comply. So we did that, and it was a very small piece of work. We identified two key places where that it would cause problems, and I'm just going to share one of them with you because it's an interesting kind of insight into how some of these rules come to be in TSIs. So we spotted this strange clause here that you see on the screen, which basically says if you've got a railway that's got a 1600mm track gauge, then your pantograph width, tip of horn to tip of horn, needs to be 1.8 meters. We looked at that and we thought, what? There's no engineering relationship between track gauge and pantograph width. There's no causal link. You can operate a narrow gauge railway with a fat pantograph. You could operate a broad gauge railway with a narrow pantograph. Why would you have that? Why would you have that link? Why would you link the two? And then we looked at the actual, it goes further than that. It's not just any pantograph that's 1.8, but it has to be specifically this one here. Right? Now that's quite an old looking drawing, so we're like, what is that? And then we did some digging. We realised that's the pantograph that's on the roof of all the Dublin Dart electrified trains that operate at 1500 volt DC in and around Dublin. So what we think happened is at some point, obviously that Dublin is part of an EU member state, they have a seat at the table on the TSIs. So at some point when the TSIs are being drafted, someone said to the Irish team, what do you want us to say about pantographs? And obviously they weren't sure, and they didn't, at that point, they weren't thinking about expanding their network necessarily, but they thought the safe thing to do is we'll just say it has to be the same as the ones we already have. So that innocent little kind of closing of a gap. The problem is, those of you who are over line engineers will know that the standard GB pantograph is only 1.6 meters wide. And the thing about pantographs is that when you try and electrify a railway, the first thing that clashes with an arched bridge is a pantograph. So the wider your pantograph is, the more money you're going to spend rebuilding bridges and lowering tracks and all the other things that help to cause all the problems that we have in CP5. So mandating a 1.8 meter pantograph, first of all, is not necessary. You can run a perfectly sensible high speed or medium speed network with a 1.6 meter pantograph. So why would you have it any wider than that? So this is a problem for Northern Ireland. It's also a problem, if anyone's listening in from Irish Rail, it's also a problem for the Republic. Because when the Republic electrifies at 25 kV AC, they're going to have to, if they're going to have rolling stock that runs on both systems, that it's going to have to be dual voltage rolling stock. And it'll have two pantographs. It'll have an AC pantograph, a DC pantograph, because the characteristics are very different. So if you're going to have another pantograph, why wouldn't you just make it a 1.6 meter wide pantograph and save yourself a lot of money on bridge reconstruction? So I would recommend that to those people thinking about electrifying the Republic. So we identified this is a problem. We're going to have to get this solved. We're going to have to get a country-specific case back into the TSI or something. So we completed that piece of work, and then in early 2024, they came to us and said, right, well, we obviously need some electrification standards. We like to write the standards before we start doing the work, which is the right way around to do it. Not always the case that some people do it, but they're doing it correctly. So we then looked at what electrification standards would be needed. Their initial request was to can we just copy the GB ones, as they've been doing historically. But once we talked around the problems of doing that, we came up with a more intelligent way of doing it. We said, let's adopt the GB ones, but what we'll do is we'll adapt them to suit Northern Ireland conditions. So we came up with this theme of adopt and adapt. By the way, we and Translink have permission from Network Rail and RSSB to do this. NR's head of standards has excellent relationships with the Network Rail head of standards and RSSB, and also Northern Ireland Railways are now an associate member of RSSB. In fact, Mark McGuigan, our client, is now attending RSSB committees, which is good to see. So we said let's look at it. Let's come up with a list of standards. Let's make sure the standards are needed, and see whether, but also see whether they need to be copied wholesale or whether they actually need to be revised to suit Northern Ireland. So we said, is the standard needed? If it's needed, what's its priority? Because clearly there's quite a lot of standards. Northern Ireland Railways does not need maintenance standards right now. It needs planning and design standards, but not construction, maintenance or operations. So we said, well, we'll prioritise them later, focus on planning and design for the moment. So we came up with a list. There are 98 standards in GB covering electrification, believe it or not. We managed to get that down to 48 by a process of elimination, saying there were a lot of standards to do with legacy systems that will never be in Northern Ireland. We managed to merge quite a lot. So for instance, wherever there's a group standard and a RIS at the moment, we put them back together. Because remember, we're trying not to hand translate an unmanageable amount of standards. They are a small team, small organisation. So we came up with this, we sifted it, and we prioritised it. Once we'd done that, they asked us to start work on the first 11. We identified 11 priority one electrification standards. So we then started to develop some principles and process around that. So the principles we came up with was the default should be to adopt the GB text. There has to be a good reason why we're going to change the text. We don't want to deviate for no good reason. Any clauses or parts of clauses that are not relevant to Northern Ireland, we will remove. So for instance, Northern Ireland is not going to have any booster transformers. It's not going to have any auto transformers. So all the clauses and standards related to those systems, we take out. Sometimes some of the characteristics are different. So for instance, the Northern Ireland vehicle gauge is 99 millimetres higher than W6A. So that affects all the minimum wire heights, for instance. So we've had to make amendments there. We also, because we're being hired as experts, we work with these standards every day. We know which standards are really good and which standards cause us problems all the time. So where a standard causes us problems all the time, if we can see a fix for it that we can do without spending lots of money on R&D or anything like that, we will make the change. So we're not afraid to actually improve standards. In fact, the wind, for those of you who are overhead line engineers, we've rewritten the wind loading standard. Remember those 69 equations? There's 5 now. No, we've simplified it. We've added a bit of conservatism in, but not very much. But we've made it much simpler to operate. So where we can see that opportunity to improve, that was based on some work we'd already done within Atkins RailEI. So essentially, Northern Ireland got that work for free. So why not get it out there? We did write one standard from scratch, which was the sectioning standard. There is no standard for sectioning in Network Rail. There's no guidance on how to do it. So we've developed guidance, and that will be in the standard as well. But that's unusual. In terms of the team, we then thought about the team we got put together. Now, clearly, you have to use your most experienced people for this. This isn't something you can put your junior people on, although we have found a way of getting our junior people involved. We'll talk about that a bit later. So we got our most experienced electrification people together. So one of them, we got Sanjay in the room, who is co-project lead with me. And we got a small group, I think it's 6, 7 people originally, something like that, together to do it. And what we found is none of us had ever had experience of writing standards. Like we've done things around, we write internal procedures and things like that. I sit on a standards committee, but I don't draft standards at the standards committee. That's not the job of the committee member. None of us had actually done it. So we thought, how can we, we need to understand how to do it. We need to find somebody who can teach us how to do it and what the pitfalls are. So luckily, there's a thing within Atkins RailEI called the Fellows Network. So there are about 50 fellows across the whole of the business, encompassing pretty much every engineering sector you can think of. And so with one email, I was able to put out a call and say, who's got experience of writing standards? And we had at least a dozen people from aerospace, defence, nuclear, all sorts of sectors who are on standards bodies, standards committees, are writing standards, managing standards. It was great. And so we got them all together, and we basically just said, explain what we're doing, and then said, tell us what we should be worried about. And what they said is, they all said the same thing. Writing the text is the easiest bit. The hardest bit is getting everyone to sign off on what you've written, getting everyone to agree to what you've written. And I've got some experience of that, obviously, on the standards committee myself. So we thought, right, we've got to really engage. We've got to come up with a process that's really going to help deliver that engagement. And we also realised early on that if you think about the report, the things, the written work that you do in your working life as a railway engineer, they're generally documents that have a pretty short shelf life. So, you'll write a Form A or Form B or specification, you draft it, goes through an assurance process, goes to the client, there's a bit of back and forth and debate on what the right words should be, and eventually it gets signed. And then some people pick it up, they go build something with it. And then once that's finished, it sits on a project-wide server and no one ever reads it again. So yeah, it has to be good quality, but if there's a few typos in there, if the formatting and presentation's a bit off, nobody generally worries about that stuff. Standards are different. Standards have a shelf life of decades. And also an audience, a much wider audience. We realise, my God, these standards are going to get put on a website somewhere, made available to basically everyone in the rail industry. Our peers, our colleagues, our competitors are all going to read these documents. They've got to be very, very good. They've got to be an extremely high standard. So we really focused on that. We focus as much on what it looks like as what the actual content is, which some of our senior people find a bit. They're not used to being told, no, you've got to indent that by this much. That's the wrong font. It takes a bit of getting used to. So we worked through. We then came up with a process. This is the whole process. I'm not going to go through it. You'll be glad to hear. But the key thing is only 3 of the boxes on this chart are actually writing, are actually drafting the text. Everything else is about reviewing, alignment with the TSIs, alignment with the current version of the ENs, because a lot of network rail standards are older and were written against obsolete versions of TSIs and ENs. It's about stripping out aligning terms and abbreviations, because I found at least half a dozen different definitions of OLE so far, and we only wanted one. So there's a lot of cleaning up when you do this process. But we set out some key principles as to whether the text should remain the same, whether it should be amended, when it should be deleted. One of the key things, in order to get this engagement, we realised that we really needed to explain not just what we're proposing the text should be, but why. If we're going to deviate from the GB text, why have we done it? So we needed a way of explaining that and putting it on the table in a really clear way. So this is what we decided to do is to not draft the standard till right at the end, which sounds really odd. We said we're to stay away. The actual standard, the document that will be published, we won't produce that till the very end. We will not do that until we have 100% agreed the text that goes in it. So then how do you agree the text? Well, you agree the text by doing it like this. We call this the tabular format or the conversion report. So essentially, it's a document. We do one of these for each standard. On the left-hand side is the GB clauses. In the middle is the proposed Northern Ireland clauses with any changes highlighted in red, any strikeouts you can see. And then over on the right is why have we changed it? If we changed it, why have we changed it? So this is the Northern Ireland version of GLRT 1210. That was the first standard that we wrote. And you can see here the contact wire height clauses. And you can see here that we've changed the numbers. We change the numbers because the vehicle's tall. Taller vehicle, higher minimum wire height. And then we explain it all over here as to what we're doing. And what we do is we draft this, we submit it to TransLink, and then we go to Belfast and we sit down with them and we explain to them. We don't go through clause by clause. Otherwise we'd never finish the job. What we do is we pull out the key points. What have we changed? Why have we changed it? Is there anything controversial? Is there anything we don't know the answer to? There are been a few instances of that. And we go through the issues and they give us feedback. And then after we finish that workshop, every standard goes through that process. And then after we finish the workshop, they then give us written comments and we then update this format. And we don't touch the standard until we've locked this down. And interestingly, on those first 11 standards, when it came to the written comments, we never had more than 10 written comments on a standard. Right, and I think there's three things playing into that. One is the brilliance of our team. Two is the level of engagement from TransLink. And three is the fact that it's such a small team. There are 2 electrification engineers in Northern Ireland Railways right now. So essentially you're getting comments from 2 people, which obviously does make things more simple. And probably the fourth factor is the fact that this is based on an established, proven, trusted standard. So 4 things actually. I'll leave you to decide what the proportions are, but I think it's mostly our brilliance, isn't it? Yeah. Let's see if I've missed anything here. Yeah, so we came up with a flowchart. We came up with drafting guidelines as well, style guide, do's and don'ts. We have really, really close tracking of responsibilities. Every standard gets assigned a technical author. So that's the person who's responsible for the content, but also a drafting admin, which is a more junior person. And they're there to put the document together, to chase down Northern Ireland legislation. Northern Ireland has different legislation to GB, to England, Wales and Scotland. So we had to go find the equivalent legislation for Northern Ireland and make sure that it was referencing the correct legislation. So the drafting admins help with all that. And it's really good experience for them. Jamie's one of the drafting admins, so you can tell us how you found it in the Q&A, Jamie. But I think it's good exposure for understanding the mechanics behind a standard and how much goes into developing. We didn't just set out the rules. We've done a lot more policing of them than we would normally do. Like Sanjay and I are probably public enemy number 1 within the team. I suspect we'll find out next week because we're doing a team building event. So we'll find out just how annoyed everyone is with us. But Sanjay and I are basically the last line of defence before the standard goes to the client. And in a number of cases, we're looking at it and going, no, you haven't followed the guidelines. Do this, do this, do this, do this. We are putting the benchmark very, very high, unusually high. If it was a design project, we wouldn't be worrying about some of the things that we do worry about. But again, these are going to be public-facing documents that last a long time. I'll just zoom in a little bit on the middle. This is just the middle part of that process. The orange is what the technical author has to do, and the purple is what the drafting admin does. So essentially, the technical author is, as you'd expect, they're looking at are there any notified national rules in this standard? Do they need to be? We ask every technical author to explain to us how they're going to develop the standard before they start. So, for instance, if you're merging 2 standards or 4 standards, in some cases we've merged up to 4, how are you going to do it? Are you going to merge the headings? Are you going to keep them end on end? How are you going to deal with appendices? It sounds banal, but you have to think about this stuff. It's no good waiting until you draft it to suddenly go, oh, hang on a minute, my plan doesn't work, because you'll spend another week rejigging everything, and then you start to blow the program. So we ask them to think really carefully about how they're going to do it before they do it. We have to do this TSI and BSEN analysis. Do we have alignment? Have the ENs changed, which generally they have? When they've changed, okay, then need to go and read the BSEN and see what the BSEN says, and does it affect the standard, and do we need to change the words in the standard? So that actually, it's a whole spider's web of interlinking standards, and it can be quite difficult to unpick it sometimes. So once we've done the tabular format, submitted it to TransLink, had the workshop, got written comments, addressed those comments, locked the text down 100%, literally every last word needs to be locked down. Then we go and produce the actual standard. So this is the first one that we produced. This is the Northern Ireland version of 1210 again. Please do pay attention to the health warning here. This has not been published yet. This is going through TransLink's internal governance at the moment. So it's not publicly available. It is subject to change. So please don't take anything on here as gospel. But so we can see here, this is the wire height clause again that you saw in the tabular format. I just want to draw your attention to two things that we did, which, if you think about copying someone's, one of the problems Northern Ireland's had is that they use a network rail standard and then that standard changes, but they're not ready. You can't just flip a switch and then switch over to a new standard. That can be quite a disruptive thing to do. So what Northern Ireland found themselves doing quite a lot of the time is sticking with the old version of the standard, which obviously gives other problems. So we wanted to find a way of adopting and adapting these standards, but then being able to track changes to the GB standard and then allow Northern Ireland to think, okay, do we want to adopt this change? Do we want to amend our own standard? But you can only do that if you can link the clauses. So one of the things we did, you can see these funny looking numbers over in the right-hand margin. They are references back to the GB source. So this is telling you that this clause is based on GLRT 1210 clause 3.1.1. So there's that clear link. And also the tabular format, that isn't a transitory document. That will remain a live document throughout the life of this standard. So that there'll always be that there'll be the rationale as to why we deviated, and there'll be a link back to the source standard, so that it will be relatively easy to manage changes to standards in GB and see how they affect Northern Ireland. And I think we're now talking about potentially doing some kind of database maybe to make that, to kind of make that process manageable. And the other thing I want to draw attention to is the bars on the left-hand margin. So we've adopted the Network Rail red, amber, green approach. Red is mandatory, amber is you need to do it unless you've got some equally safe alternative, and green is guidance. So we adopted that, and some of the older Network Rail standards don't have it. So where they don't have it, we have inserted it. So we're delivering to TransLink a consistent set of standards, which clearly Network Rail, because Network Rail has this huge long tail of standards, it's never going to be possible for Network Rail to do that. But it is definitely possible for TransLink to do it because it's so small. The other thing that we did, you'll notice the black bar on the left-hand side, and the black bar means a notified national rule. So we'll have a key advantage over GB standards, which is where, if we're GB standards, you have to go to the DFT website, download a spreadsheet, and then try and cross-check it against the standards. We're just labelling them, signposting them clearly in the standards, so you can see what the national rules are. So we delivered the first 11 electrification standards, and we're working on how many more have we got in play? About another 10 at the moment. They're almost over the line, almost there, and yeah, there'll probably be more in the future. But then I think the work we did on the electrification standards just highlighted to the head of standards just how the situation that the other disciplines were in of just copying GB standards wasn't going to work in future either. As soon as that idea makes contact with the European Rail Agency, they're going to get into trouble. So like, could you extend this process to every other discipline, please? Could you extend it to signalling, track, civils, telecoms, and since January this year, even rolling stock. So we've now literally got the whole railway system in play, and we've got about 30 people now working on this across all disciplines. And yeah, we need a slightly different approach with the other disciplines, because obviously with the electrification, we've got a free hand. We can pretty much say what we think they should do because we haven't got the electrification yet. So there's no existing equipment. But clearly you can't start messing around with the signalling standard without thinking very carefully about what the impact will be on Translate's existing signalling installation, signalling maintenance, and all of that stuff. So we've had to do quite a lot of work with the heads of discipline for those disciplines in Translate to just understand what their drivers are, what their priorities are, and what are the things that we need to avoid doing. So that was a slight, not necessarily a tweak to the process, but a tweak to the level of engagement. We needed to up the engagement level again. The other thing that's caused a challenge is kind of the team getting so big. That you all know how you learn how to do things, right? You all sit and read all your company policies, don't you? Or do you just ask the person you sit next to how to do it? It's the second one, isn't it? The trouble is, if you ask the person next to you how to do it, and they've been at, and it's the usual thing of this attenuation of knowledge that happens. So what we found is there are people who think they're doing the right thing, but they haven't actually read the rules. And what we say to them is, go away, read the rules. Don't start work on that standard until you've read them, please. So we've had to do a lot of policing on that. Okay, well, drawing it to a close now then, what are the key challenges that we found? If you're adopting and adapting standards, the biggest challenge is not the technical content. That's the easiest of steps. It's logistical. It's a logistical challenge. We have about 40 standards in play now, so it can be quite hard just to track exactly where everything's got to and what needs to be done with them. So it's a logistical challenge and it's a stakeholder management challenge. You need to get the right people at the right time. I think going to Belfast and doing it face to face has been key. We've had people fly in for 2 hours, present their stuff, and then come back. But it's been worth it because we've got that level of engagement, and we haven't had anything rejected. We haven't had anything thrown out. We've had some debate on particular clauses, but actually we generally know what they want because we've spent time with them talking to them. From a technical perspective, the hardest thing by far is understanding TSIs, national rules, and how they interlink and how they link to the ENs. What we've realised, most engineers, and I suspect most of you in this room, don't really worry about the TSIs or the national rules or the ENs because you're reading the network rail standards and the RSSB standards, and as long as you comply with them, you're golden, right? So we suddenly have this team have to understand how all this complexity links, and it's not helped by the fact that the TSIs are horrific documents to read. They're not easy to follow because of the way they're structured, and they tend to point to an annex in an appendix, which points to an EN, and by the time you've found the actual technical content, you can no longer remember what the question is you're even trying to answer. It can be quite difficult. And the TSIs and the ENs do not align. You might have a group standard that references the current EN, whereas a TSI, it also references the TSI, but the TSI references an old version of that EN. So which version are we following? And you've got to resolve all these problems. You must have a well-developed process and a well-developed set of rules. That's absolutely critical. And the more people you add to that team, the more critical that becomes. And more policing is going to be needed. But you'll also need to adapt the process as you go along. So those black bars you saw for NNRs, that wasn't the original plan. We tried to use red to denote NNRs, and we delivered the first 11 standards actually with that mechanism. But then we realised it's just going to be very confusing for the reader. How do they differentiate national rules from mandatory requirements that aren't national rules? So we decided to make a change, and we went back and iterated those first 11 in light of experience. Presentation format is just as important as the text itself. That should go without saying. I should have said earlier actually. We set the team an impossible challenge. It's sometimes useful to have an impossible goal because it focuses minds. And the impossible goal that we gave the team was all of these standards should read as though they're written by one person. Yeah, not practically possible, but it sends a message to people as to the level of quality that we're looking for when we write these documents. And I don't think we're getting there. I don't think we're doing bad on that test. Checking process obviously has to be extremely robust, very, very robust. The technical author needs to know what they're going to do with the standard before they start drafting. It's no good finding out halfway through. So you do it. The irony is a lot of the technical authors are so used to these standards that it's like, have you read it? Oh yeah, I read it a couple of years ago. No, read it. Read it now, line by line again, because typically you're using some of the clauses in the standards. You're not really worrying about the other stuff. It doesn't affect what you do. When you reread a standard, you go, I've forgotten that was in there. So you need to read it before you start working on it. In-person workshops, absolutely crucial. Your production rate, just like any project, it's no good churning out 10 standards a week if your client can't absorb and review 10 standards a week. So you have to match your production rate to the client's ability. And obviously they are a small team. In fact, they're probably a smaller team than we are, aren't they? That's the thing. Atkins Rouse has got more resources to bring to bear on this than Translink has. So last slide, and Sanjay and I were having a debate about this. Apparently I haven't got these numbers right. So we've certainly had 10 electrification standards delivered in final format, although that's changing literally now because we've been submitting new ones this week. So that number's already out of date. We've got, in terms of standards that have gone through the workshop stage, we've done another 27. So that's another 10 for electrification. We've got more. 4 for civils. You think it's 4 for civils? Okay. Fleet, we've done 2 through the workshop, and we've got another 6 coming. Yes. Signalling, we've got 6 through the workshop. Yes. 3 telecoms, because there are only 3 telecom standards. 6 and then yeah, 4 through track. 6. Okay. See, this is a problem. It's a constantly moving feast. This is, and we are still working on several more. So, and another way of looking at success of this project is that those first 11 standards we got into contract in October 24, and we delivered all of them by I think March 25 in their final form. So 10 standards in 6 months. Imagine how long it would take this side of the water. I mean, when we first started this work, we were quite worried about, there's a lot of unknowns about this. We didn't know how the engagement was going to go. We didn't know how easy it'd be to get agreement. So I don't think any of us would have predicted that we would have delivered 10 in 6 months. Yeah. So, in conclusion, developing standards is hard, but not in the ways you think it's hard. Relationships are key. You need to develop those relationships, develop the engagement, and that engagement is essential. You need to write a bespoke process. It's going to be different for if we did another, one of the nice things about this project is we've gone from being the people saying, how do we do this work, to now actually people can come to us and we would explain to them how to do this work. But if we did this for another client, it would be a different process again. Every time you do this, it's going to be different, depending on the legal framework, the country you're in, and all the other variables. You have to police the process. You have to iterate it in light of experience. But yeah, in conclusion, we've now got a really solid team who can write standards for you if that's what you want. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
So no, I can't see. Sorry.
Any questions in the room? I unfortunately can't see who's online, so I don't.
84 attendance online, so
Oh wow. Okay.
quite
Sorry?
84.
84. Excellent.
Have we got any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Matt Gibson from Amy. Question around the safety assurance. Was there a need for any safety assurance? Because obviously one use of standards is under the pump safety method legislation as part of safety cases.
Mhm.
Where you've changed standards, do you have to
Yes.
have any safety assurance?
Generally, when we change it, a lot of the change that we're doing is what I call administrative change, either removing stuff that Northern Ireland just doesn't have and will never have, or amending it to point to the right piece of legislation or the right part. And you know, there's hundreds of references to network rail bodies and network rail departments and network rail roles and things like that. So a lot of it's very rare that we actually make a change to standard that would change the technical nature of the outcome. If we did, then we will generally flag that up to Translink as being something that they need to take on, because they will obviously they've got their own insurance and governance. Yeah, they'll go through. Yeah.
Whether it,
Sorry, I'm sorry, more Amy again. I'm just taking the lead from that. You referred to the use of BSCN, so British Standards Euronorms. Was there any drive to take British part of that out, just leave it as Euronorm?
No, because we had that discussion right at the start, didn't we? I think, and we came to the conclusion that legally Northern Ireland needs to be following the BSENs, not the ENs.
Okay.
Can't quite remember how we got to that conclusion, but that was where we ended up. One of the things I don't like about this project is you start turning into a lawyer, whether you like it or not.
that's something against lawyers.
No, I don't think it's lawyers, just don't want to be one.
No.
So, yeah. But yeah.
And then also in your, where you've referenced the standards, so for example, you have GLRT 1210 reference, but you hadn't got a revision of that standard in
No,
it.
but there's a whole preamble. So in the front of the standard,
You do refer to which
right at the
version
front of
it
the
is.
standard,
Okay.
we're completely transparent. We say this standard has been based on the following standards.
Yeah, I saw that on one
Yeah.
side, but couldn't see the revision of it.
It's in the preamble.
Okay.
It's in the opening sections of the document. It basically says if you see this,
Yeah.
it denotes
that
it means
okay.
this. So yeah, it's all there. Yeah.
Anything online? Questions?
Nothing yet.
That was such a comprehensive briefing, Gary. There's big
So
questions.
that standards are so boring.
Can I just
You
ask a
said-
question here? Online?
You said that the trickiest bit is to convince people to sign it off rather than writing. Yeah,
Well, it's
Kind of makes sense.
debating the word. It's debating what should be in the standards. Actually, it's getting harder now that we're doing multiple disciplines. It's getting harder because we've agreed things with discipline A as to what the general approach should be, and then discipline B comes along. Of course, again, it's very senior people, and they used to being able to shout, be able to say, "Well, I want mine to be like this," and we're saying, "Well, that's not what we've agreed with your head of standards." So there is a bit of, there's a bit of internal alignment needs to be done, getting everybody to understand what the bigger picture is.
Because I think in a way, perhaps RailEI was an easier challenge than other disciplines.
Definitely. Oh yeah,
where
yeah,
there
yeah,
is
absolutely.
already a culture there.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And we have had to do more work, definitely. We've had to have a higher level of engagement and probably spend more time. I think the lesson for any future work would be spend more time talking before you actually commit to writing the thing.
It's been a learning journey for all the other disciplines. But we have been on this journey for longer than now. We kind of understand that they haven't done it before and probably not used to it. So it has taken that time to understand exactly what we are trying to do, how we are trying to do it.
Yeah, and we've also had to work to convince them that this is the right approach, because obviously this looks complicated compared to what they've historically been doing, which is just put a cover sheet on a rail standard and you're good to go. So they're like, why are we doing this? What's it? Because they haven't yet had the experience of taking a project through a no-bo. Some of you in this room have. So so you've got the scars, they haven't at the moment. Or other than the people who worked on Ground Central. So Ground Central is Belfast main station. It's a completely new station. They built a completely new station next door to the old one. Opened it a couple of years ago. And so the people who worked on that project have felt that pain, but they're not the people we're dealing with. So they don't understand. Sometimes they don't understand why you need to do this. So we want to take them on that journey.
We do have questions. I
Yeah.
saw something flash up, but now I've gone into limp mode
Yeah.
on my phone.
So let's take a line where you have made changes to the source standard to make it specific to Northern Ireland. Has TSI or SSB and R taken cognizance and considered for improving their own standards?
Okay, I'm going to answer. I'm very conscious that there will be Network Rail people on the call. And in the room. So I have to be careful what I say. I don't think they have. I think the Network Rail standards machine is a machine and it moves very slowly. And there's no obvious one person that we could hand our changes to kind of enter that system. Obviously we've got a head of standards, but no, we haven't done that. It's an interesting question.
Got standard owners that you can go to.
Yeah, I don't think we generally change an RSSB level standards, are we? That would be
1210.
no, we didn't change anything. We changed things, so it's a good example of what we changed in 1210. So 1210 says things about APC magnets for neutral sections. Northern Ireland are not going to use magnets. They're either going to use an RFID or a Eurobelize. So we swept away all those bits in the back where it's the magnet dimensions and things, swept that away. So there's a good example of that's a technical change. That isn't going to impact on safety as long as that Belize system is designed correctly, which it will be. And obviously there will be it has its own standard. That Belize will have its own standard, which probably will be a straight adoption of the GB standard. So generally, RSSB level, we wouldn't be tinkering with anything that we would want to feed back to RSSB. We're brave, but we're not that brave.
Have you had any engagement with DRA? Yeah.
Not directly, but we have assisted TransLink and DFI. So TransLink and DFI meet ERA regularly, and we've attended at least one of those meetings, haven't we? Just to help them with that.
Some of these standards are going to be used as source standards for their NNR. So we have assisted in that, and they fed back to the ERA as standards.
Yeah. I used to suggest that if there are questions online, it might be useful and quicker for people to just.
Do we invite them off for you and ask the question?
Yeah.
Directly. Just you can pitch on your.
Do you want to ask the people?
There is a question already now. Yeah. Does Northern Ireland currently have a design system such as UKMS? And if so, what you have done so far linked to that?
Good question. So the guidance we've had from TransLink is that they intend to use UKMS for all of their installations because, again, small organisation, limited funding, limited resources. They're not going to develop their own system, and I don't think they just want to leave it to the market to decide either. So they're almost looking at UKMS as being like a mini TSI. It's a TSI compliant system, so it'll provide them with a level of compliance right out of the box. So one of the more interesting things that we wrote in the standards is that any OLE product needs to have Network Rail product approval. Yeah, so they're actually just literally leaning on don't pull faces. They're leaning on Network Rail's product assurance system because they don't want to develop their own product acceptance. So yeah, they will be using UKMS, which means that they need to have a 1.6 meter panel.
Not 1.8.
Not 1.8.
I suggested people to pitch on.
Yeah, do you want to call the names out and let them ask
Rob, you can ask your question now.
Thank you. Hi, Gary. Just wondering, are you
Rob
able
Dafford.
to Rob Dafford
if you're on
for
there, floor is yours.
Are you able to summarise what you did to get from lots of wind equations down to 5 for the wind loading? And no is an acceptable
It's not
answer.
like Rob to
I
be.
was going to say, is there any sound
Are you able to summarize?
Should be, yeah.
I was speaking.
Maximum, right? But here, well, are you able to summarize what you did to get from 60 plus equations to only 5? It's a good question.
I can, because Dave England's not here, and Dave did all the hard work. No, so we did some internal work in Atkins Railhouse about 4 or 5 years ago to look at the whole wind loading thing, and Dave's got some very strong and well-founded views on Civ 72 and the level of complexity in there. And what he has done essentially is to make all the orography stuff a lot simpler. So that, yeah. But beyond that, no, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. That's, you could probably do a whole 3/4 of an hour on that.
Our next presentation.
Yeah.
I think there is a setting with the meeting that people cannot.
Okay,
They need to be made presenters to.
right, could be,
So I'll ask then, is there a desire to introduce or replicate the suite of RSE standards, or will the checks and balance the RSE suite of documents be delivered in some other way? Is something else that Majors and are.
Now, someone from Network Rail help me out. The RSC ones, do they all
Same
process?
systems engineering.
Oh, okay. Not so far. They've not asked us about systems engineering. Maybe we should add it to our shopping list. But no, we're not doing anything on that at the moment.
Okay, we got one more or a couple more?
What if Transnic has a product they want to incorporate, which is not product approved? Do they anticipate approaching NR to get?
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that if that were I'm not saying I couldn't see a scenario where TransLink would want to do something that NetRail hadn't done. I think it's less likely. But if they did, I guess at that point they would probably want to sit down and say, well, okay, so we'll need to have our own parallel process that is in addition to, so you can have a product approved, NetRail product approved product, or you could go through this route. But at the moment, I'm not aware of anything that they've done themselves.
Murray Golden from Kite Projects. We had that question come up the other week.
Yeah.
The product, the new foundation
Yeah.
product for RailEI. Translink actually invited us to go over to Ireland 2 weeks ago to take them and show them the product in view of what you are doing.
Yeah.
And what their big picture they want.
Right.
And we're back there in 2 weeks' time as well.
Yeah.
So that is
I think
they are looking at ways of how they can do
I
that.
think
Because
they're going to have to, because otherwise it's very constraining, isn't it? To have to use things that NetRail use.
What will be the implications if, say, the TSI and the rules for Ireland will diverge in a certain direction, and the NTSN?
Yeah, I didn't mention that. It was in my notes, but I didn't mention it. But the TSIs and the NTSNs will probably diverge in future. That's Simon and I and Sanjay are involved with some work to try and make that happen, and that we can do a talk on that another day. But they are likely to diverge. What happens? No idea. There are people who take the view that we need to keep strict convergence, because that way, if we do decide to rejoin the EU, might happen in my lifetime, I don't know. It would obviously make that far easier. But let's be honest, if we rejoin the EU, we got way bigger problems than alignment with the TSIs. There'll be some very difficult conversations between the British government and the EU if that were to happen. There are other people, crucially the DfT, their view is very clear, and they actually wrote to the RSSB in 2023 and said, we expect you, and I'm paraphrasing, apologies, but this is basically what it says, we expect you, RSSB and the industry, to seek opportunities to amend the NTSN, and what they mean is to deviate from the TSIs in order to achieve cost efficiency. They're very clear on that. So I think divergence is going to happen. because the DFT wanted to happen. A number of us in industry who particularly have felt the pain of trying to comply with some of the clauses in the energy TSI. It's funny because you're talking to the signalling people and they're like, there's nothing wrong with the TSIs. So the CCS TSI, they're very happy with it. Okay, great. But the energy TSI has got problems that need to be resolved. But actually, I'm now hearing is that the actual TSI committees now increasingly recognise that there are problems within the TSIs. So it may be that we're all heading towards the same goal, but of course we won't do it the same way. Different routes, exactly. Yeah.
How transferable?
Last
How
one.
transferable is all this work to the Republic of Ireland?
So I said it.
How transferable is all this work to the-
It's extremely transferable. In fact, it's not just transferable. It's clearly pretty essential. If you look at this map, pretty essential that the standards that are applied to this electrified railway are common on both sides of the board, at least to a certain level. You know, the detail can be different, but at the sort of technical interface level, they need to be adopting the same rules. So there are discussions going on with Dublin, and that's all I'm going to say about it.
And one last for me. Were there any copyright related
No,
issues?
no, because we have permission from Network Rail.
So it's just formally.
That was when we were approached and they said, would you like to get into contract on this? That was one of the things that we specifically wrote, that only on the condition that you get copyright, because if those of you who follow me on LinkedIn know I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about copyright law, and so I've got to practice what I preach. So yeah.
That's what it's on your second slide.
Right, we are going to wrap it up now. We've overrun more than normally, but thank you, Gary.
Anyone hasn't signed in?
There's not enough names on it.
There's not very many names on there. There is a couple of sheets I appreciate, but this one is also blank. Can you make sure your name's on at least one of them, please?
And thanks to everybody online. That's fantastic turnout today, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of others watching on YouTube, Gary. So
I think it's the greatest attendance.
yeah, pretty good, pretty good. Yeah.
Since Garrett's last one.
87 was the big.
Okay, thanks everybody.